So I figured I kind of wanted to talk a bit more about my thoughts on the national park system and wilderness areas and tourism. Right now I'm in Yosemite at Mariposa Grove, where a lot of the giant sequoias are. And yeah, I've had a few thoughts lately. I think with wilderness and national park management, there's this constant debate between conservation versus access, where on one hand, like one side of the debate really wants to focus on conserving nature at the expense of like basically restricting access to the public and to development, while the other side wants to increase access to the public at the expense of potentially harming nature. Now, this debate often does tend to fall along kind of like the left right political spectrum. Leftists tend to be more pro conservation, whereas right wingers tend to be more pro public access and pro development. But it's not always the case, because I have seen some people who are in favor of more access making kind of like left wing arguments. Although, again, it's like, are these people actually left wingers, or are they right wingers using left wing arguments tactically? Are they, third positionist, Nazbol, what have you? Hard to say in some of these cases, but the argument that they sometimes use is the equity argument, which is like, by restricting access to the parks for the sake of natural conservation, any policies that they enact, whether it be like entry reservation systems or whatever, these policies inherently um, restrict access more so for poor or disadvantaged people more than anyone else. Like, that's the argument they use, that rich people, Instagram influencers will always find a way to get into the parks, whereas it's the poor people or the disadvantaged people who will be left out by these policies. There's some truth to this argument. There is. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to say exactly where I side in this debate, because I see the arguments on both sides. I think certain things are exaggerated, like when the conservationists talk about trash in the parks. Like, I've seen hardly any trash that people leave behind. It's really an exaggerated issue. Maybe it was an issue during the big event of 2020 when parks were shut down and some of them ended up getting like vandalized. And I think that happened during like the government shutdowns too. But by and large, trash in the parks isn't really much of an issue. What I see a bit more of is graffiti, like where people carve their names into like rocks and trees and tree stumps and stuff like that. That is a bigger issue than garbage. And it's definitely something I strongly disapprove of. I'm not sure what can really be done about it, like other than like putting up cameras or having more staff for the sake of security. But I definitely think that like it shouldn't be socially accepted. Like, when people see people doing that shit, they should call it out. Like, I remember when I was in Rome at the Colosseum, I saw a Chinese guy carving his name into the Colosseum, and I yelled at him for it. Actually, it was me and Argent. We were there, and yeah, we gave him shit for it. This guy, I don't think he even understood us, but he could probably understand our tone of voice at very least. Um, but yeah, I mean, one thing I've noticed is that there tends to be a dichotomy where if wilderness land is controlled by the government, there tends to be more restrictions. Whereas if it's not controlled by the government, like, or by like the federal government, there tends to be less restrictions. So for instance, like in the national parks themselves, it usually tends to be more restrictive, more toward conservation, in the sense that like they don't allow much development. They sometimes have these entry reservation systems, and they're very strict on like conservation rules. Whereas in places of natural beauty that aren't technically part of the national park system, they're not national parks, national monuments, or anything of the sort. I guess these areas would be controlled by like municipal governments, like any other community. Those places tend to be less strict. And like Sedona would be an example. Now in Sedona, it's a town that is basically surrounded by wilderness areas with hiking trails in Arizona. As I posted in the previous video, there is some development where they're actually going like right into the wilderness areas and building like McMansions and hotels and stuff. And that, I think in Sedona, it's gone too far. There's a lot of areas that have been built up in Sedona that never should have been. I'm not going to say that the town of Sedona shouldn't exist at all. I mean, some people might say that. I think though it's been allowed to like sprawl out a bit too much into like the actual wilderness areas, and some of this development should have never been approved, and frankly some of it that exists should be expropriated and torn down. And Niagara Falls is another key example of that. Like that, they should have never built all those casino towers near the falls and all that stuff. It's an eyesore. It's hideous. So yeah, I mean, in this debate, like there's problems with both sides, but at the end of the day, I think I would side more with the conservationists if I had to. But again, like I think sometimes, I know this is the my big brain centrism, but I think sometimes the solution can be in between. Although it depends on what issue, because I think in some areas maybe the park staff, the national parks aren't radical enough. Like for instance, one area where I think they could help the environment more is dealing with by far the biggest negative environmental impact of tourism, which is transportation emissions, which I think there's a lot of parks that should restrict vehicle access and go to a shuttle only system, kind of like Zion has done. The problem with that though is underfunding. In Zion, I don't know if it's underfunding or contempt for the visitor, and maybe a mix of both, but in Zion, for instance, the buses are just overcrowded. They don't come frequently enough, and they don't operate late enough into the evening, probably not even early enough into the morning either. Like they should be operating much more frequently and at like earlier and later hours. Like I think the last bus is like 8 p.m. Like that's not even sunset time this time of the year. And considering that Zion has some pretty big hikes, like, I mean, I've gone on big hikes where I didn't, finish the hike until well after dark. Like, I mean, at the Grand Canyon, I was out there, I think, past 1 a.m. But again, like, I mean, I don't know. Like, I do think it's a good idea, like the shuttle bus systems, because they say in Zion, they have like informational signs, and they talk about how the park used to be really polluted because of all the exhaust from vehicles in the valley, and how implementing the shuttle bus system has helped with that. And it could probably help, both with smog in the immediate sense and also just carbon emissions in the larger sense. To do this. Again, like I don't think cars can ever be eliminated 100% from the equation in national parks, because it's like even if you can take a shuttle bus in the park, there's still a question of getting to the park. I mean, theoretically, you could take transit, but also another problem with that is like hikers tend to like require a lot of things, and it's like when you're hauling around like a shitload of luggage, like I don't know if that's always practical using public transit. Like for instance, the amount of luggage that I need on hiking trips is a lot more than the amount of luggage that I need on trips where I'm going to like cities and towns. So that's another issue with like relying entirely on public transit for that. And again, it's like, it's one thing if it's like you're just going to the park for the day and you drive there and you hop on the shuttle, but it's like if you're using only public transit in the entire trip, it's like it becomes logistically difficult with the amount of stuff you're carrying. I don't know. Like it's hard to balance these things. Like maybe it would be possible to make the national parks entirely public transit oriented, including even getting from the cities to the parks. But I think it would be difficult. I'm not saying it's not doable, but there'd be a lot of issues with it. I think in Switzerland, they've managed to do that to some extent. But yeah. I think regarding the whole like entry reservations thing, I don't know. Maybe the best solution is to like alternate it day by day. I just feel like they're not entirely being honest and open about like the reasons behind it. Like, is it because of overcrowding? What are the actual impacts of the overcrowding? Like, are they doing this on behalf of the environment, or are they doing this on behalf of like Instagram influencers who want there to be fewer unwashed masses in the park because the unwashed masses are ruining their sexy pictures? Like, you know, it's like it's hard to say who's like really benefiting from these policies. And another thing is, frankly, like there are certain parks that like could be taking on more of the crowds and diverting them from the more popular ones, but there's some serious mismanagement in these parks. Like Canyon de Chelly is the top example of that. Like that's a park that used to see a lot more visitors than it does now. And it's partly because the park is just very poorly managed. Like they, as I said in my early video, they closed one of the main overlooks allegedly because of vehicle break-ins, which is just stupid because it's like, I mean, are you going to also stop tourists from going to San Francisco? I mean, you're probably more likely to get your vehicle broken into in San Francisco than at Canyon de Chelly. So I don't know. I think it's just bullshit. And I also think Canyon de Chelly, keep in mind, Canyon de Chelly is on a native reservation. But it is technically controlled by the federal government. And I mean, I think there are a lot of issues that stem from that from the where it is, including the aforementioned crime issue. So again, like, I mean, there's a lot of like leftists who say that like, oh, we need to just give back all the national parks and wilderness areas to the Native Americans. But it's like, I'm sorry, but doing that is going to create a lot more issues. And Canyon de Chelly is an example of why, frankly, because I mean, a lot of these areas suffer from chronic like crime issues and things like that. And it's like, I feel like that is just going to exacerbate those problems. Like, um, but yeah, all things considered, I think it's good that we have national parks and such. Um, I think it's probably better than the alternative because when you look at, say, Sedona or Niagara Falls, I think when areas are not protected enough, like that's the worst outcome. And I think it's better to have a bit like for an area to be too protected rather than not protected enough. Like if I, again, like it's very hard to do the perfect balancing act between the two. So I think if I was going to fall more on one side or the other, it would be probably more on the side of too much conservation because at the end of the day, like the worst thing they'll do is make it harder to get to these places. But if there's not enough protection, the worst thing that could happen is the areas are just destroyed. So, I mean, yeah, that would be kind of my thoughts on like basically all the issues surrounding the national parks.